This is my video for the Crime Reflections Journal, starting off with the overview of the past 3 weeks. Week 1 was kind of an introduction into everything. We learned a lot about different terminologies that we'll see more throughout the unit and in that first week. We learned a lot about media's role in how the public sees crime compared to the actual crime trends. We saw a big overview of the US justice system, kind of how one piece plays into another, and then we talked about the crime control versus due process. And then in week 2, we learned a lot about the social definition versus the legal definition of crime. We learned that the social definition is more people's versions of how they see crime, such as people not obeying the norms, versus the legal definition of crime is based off of the 7 elements of crime that go into the deeper, like what they did to commit a crime and how it all adds up. It isn't just some outbreak of the normal standard. And then the 7 elements of crime were super cool to learn about. They kind of started with what the actual crime was, why it was made, what evidence it had, what backed up the person, kind of to see if they were insane or if they were mentally in a good state, and then kind of the legal actions that take place after that, and then finally concluding with the punishment. We talked about the major sources of crime statistics and crime rates, things such as the UCR, the NCVS, and others like that. Those are good places for people, instead of going to the media, instead of going to news sources, they can go to those places to get correct information about crime rates. And then week 2, we also talked about just like our local crime rates and how everything that we have learned kind of relates to our own, kind of putting it into our own lives. And then week 3, we learned a lot about the rule of law in the US system, kind of the theories that back up this rule of law and why we do what we do today. There are 2 different types of law, the substantive and the procedural law. We learned about the differences between their 2 and the 2 different applications. And then we were also introduced to due process rights. And from there, we also learned a lot about the amendments. And that was super cool to kind of refresh my brain about. I learned a lot about it in high school, but kind of going back to that and knowing what I know now, I now see why those are in place the way that they are. And then I looked over 5 different jobs that contain crime. The first one is pretty basic. It's a police officer. It's just a law enforcement. They investigate crimes, they protect communities, and keep that standard norm. The next one is a forensic scientist. They kind of analyze physical evidence from crime scenes, and then they can take that evidence to help find a suspect or support reasoning behind why they are a suspect. The third one was a criminal lawyer. This one's super interesting to me because it's something that I have looked into, something that I may want to do. They represent clients in criminal cases, whether that's the victim or the offender. They work with those people to kind of figure out their side of the story and to kind of make them win in that case. A probation officer is something that I don't really know a lot about, but wanted to know more about. Probation officer basically supervises someone who is put on probation rather than someone who is put in jail, kind of less serious cases, and they help them kind of go back to their old ways while ensuring that they comply with their law, kind of get them to be that normal citizen standard. And then the last one was a criminologist. I had never heard of this before, so it was super cool to kind of learn more about. A criminologist studies the causes and the patterns and then the effects of crime to inform crime, and then they also help to prevent it in the future. This one was really cool to learn about. It's kind of how I feel I took my last few assignments. The last discussion I kind of went through the 7 elements of crime and took a local crime story and kind of put them into that. And I feel like this criminologist job is something like that. So if I were to choose a career in crime, I think I would go for the criminologist. I think it's super interesting to kind of study the patterns of crime, see why someone did it, how their mental state was when they did it, and then why they proceeded to do it. I think studying like why people completed they were insane is really interesting. Kind of studying the mind part rather than the physical part and the fighting part. It's a more behind the scenes job, but it's super necessary to understand patterns and save and like start fresh historically. I think this would be a good thing for me. I'm not very political, and so a part of their job is kind of fixing patterns. I think politics can play a lot into that. If you're very political and you're very like against gun violence, for example, your role would want to make guns look as bad as possible. However, not being very political, you don't have a right or left side to kind of view that on. You just look at the facts and then go from there. I think that would be a very good thing for me. I don't like to focus a lot about like really far back events. I like to focus on the future now and what we can do to make a better future rather than repeating the past. So yeah, that was my overview and my jobs and what I hope to be in crime, and I hope that I can take that a little bit further, kind of know more about a criminologist and just apply what I know into future units. Thanks.